December 16th, 1949. The train rattled through the frozen Siberian landscape, its wheels clicking rhythmically against the tracks as it carried Mao Zedong toward Moscow. It was his first trip outside China, his first meeting with Joseph Stalin, the man he had studied and admired for decades. Mao sat in his compartment, smoking cigarette after cigarette, watching the endless expanse of snow and forest roll past the window. He was 56 years old, the leader of the world's most populous nation, the man who had just completed one of the most remarkable military and political victories in history. After 22 years of struggle, against the nationalists, against the Japanese, against overwhelming odds, Mao had united China under communist rule. On October 1st, 1949, he had stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing and proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Now he was traveling to Moscow to meet with Stalin, to forge an alliance between the world's two great communist powers to secure Soviet aid for China's reconstruction. He expected to be welcomed as a brother, as an equal, as a fellow revolutionary who had achieved what many thought impossible. He was about to be disappointed. The train arrived in Moscow on December 16th, pulling into a station decorated with red banners and portraits of Stalin. A military band played. Soviet officials stood at attention. Cameras flashed. But as Mao stepped onto the platform, he noticed something odd. Stalin wasn't there. Instead, he was greeted by Vyacheslav Molotov, the foreign minister, and a handful of lesser officials. They were polite, even deferential, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. They escorted Mao to a motorcade of black ZIS limousines and drove him through the snowy streets of Moscow to a dacha outside the city. "Comrade Stalin sends his greetings," Molotov said in the car. "He looks forward to meeting with you. He has been following your revolution with great interest." "When will I meet with him?" Mao asked. "Soon," Molotov replied. "Very soon. Comrade Stalin is very busy, as you can imagine. But he will make time for you." The dacha was comfortable but isolated, surrounded by guards and security personnel. Mao was shown to his quarters, told that he should rest after his long journey, and informed that someone would contact him about scheduling a meeting with Stalin. Then he was left alone. Days passed. Mao waited. He read Soviet newspapers, which barely mentioned his arrival. He walked in the gardens, accompanied always by security guards who were polite but watchful. He asked repeatedly about meeting Stalin and was told repeatedly that the General Secretary was busy but would see him soon. On December 21st, 5 days after his arrival, Mao was finally summoned to the Kremlin. He was driven through Moscow at night, the city dark and cold, its streets empty. The Kremlin loomed before him, its walls and towers lit by floodlights, its red stars glowing against the black sky. He was escorted through corridors lined with guards, past rooms filled with the machinery of Soviet power, until finally he was shown into Stalin's office. The room was large, but not ostentatious, dominated by a massive desk and the inevitable portrait of Lenin on the wall. Stalin sat behind the desk, smoking his pipe, his face expressionless. He was 70 years old, shorter than Mao had expected, his hair gray, his mustache yellowed by tobacco, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, missing nothing. "Comrade Mao," Stalin said, not rising from his chair, "welcome to Moscow. Congratulations on your victory in China." Mao bowed slightly, uncertain of the protocol. "Thank you, Comrade Stalin. It is an honor to finally meet you. I've studied your works for many years. The Soviet Union has been an inspiration to all revolutionaries." Stalin gestured to a chair. "Sit. Tell me about China. Tell me how you defeated Chiang Kai-shek." For the next hour, Mao talked about the Chinese Revolution, about the Long March, about guerrilla warfare in the countryside, about the final campaign that had driven the nationalists from the mainland to Taiwan. He spoke passionately, proudly, expecting Stalin to be impressed, to recognize the magnitude of what the Chinese Communist Party had achieved. But Stalin's face remained impassive. He asked occasional questions, always pointed, always probing. How many troops did Mao command? What was China's industrial capacity? How much territory did the nationalists still control? What were Mao's plans for Taiwan? Gradually, Mao realized that this wasn't a conversation between equals, between fellow revolutionaries celebrating a shared victory. This was an interrogation. Stalin was assessing him, measuring him, trying to determine whether Mao was an asset or a threat to Soviet interests. "And what do you want from the Soviet Union?" Stalin asked finally. Mao leaned forward, eager to discuss the real purpose of his visit. "We need aid, Comrade Stalin. Economic aid, technical aid, military aid. China has been devastated by decades of war. Our industry is primitive. Our people are poor. We need Soviet expertise to build socialism in China." "What kind of aid?" Stalin asked. "Everything," Mao said. "Factories, power plants, railways, weapons. We need Soviet engineers, Soviet advisors, Soviet technology. We need loans to finance reconstruction, and we need a treaty, a formal alliance between our two countries to demonstrate to the world that China and the Soviet Union stand together." Stalin was silent for a long moment, puffing on his pipe. Then he said, "The Soviet Union already has a treaty with China. We signed a treaty of friendship and alliance with the nationalist government in 1945. That treaty is still in effect." Mao stared at him, not quite believing what he was hearing. "But Comrade Stalin, that treaty was with Chiang Kai-shek's government. That government no longer controls China. It has fled to Taiwan. The People's Republic is the legitimate government of China now." "Perhaps," Stalin said, "but international law is complicated. The nationalist government still holds China's seat at the United Nations. Many countries still recognize it as the legitimate government of China. If we abrogate our treaty with the nationalists and sign a new treaty with you, we risk international complications." "What complications?" Mao asked, his voice rising despite his effort to remain calm. "The Soviet Union is the leader of the socialist world. Your recognition would establish the legitimacy of the People's Republic. Other countries would follow your lead." Stalin smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Comrade Mao, you are new to international politics. These things take time. We must be careful, must consider all the implications. The Soviet Union has many interests to balance." Mao felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had traveled thousands of miles, had come to Moscow expecting to be welcomed as a brother, as an equal. Instead, he was being treated like a supplicant, like a minor official seeking favors from a superior. And worse, he was beginning to realize that Stalin didn't trust him. The meeting ended inconclusively. Stalin promised to consider Mao's requests, to study the question of a new treaty, to consult with his advisors. Mao was driven back to his dacha, his mind churning with anger and confusion. Over the following days, Mao waited again. He requested meetings with Stalin and was told the General Secretary was busy. He tried to meet with other Soviet officials and found them evasive, unwilling to commit to anything without Stalin's approval. He was taken on tours of factories and collective farms, shown the achievements of Soviet socialism, but these felt like distractions, like ways to keep him occupied, while Stalin decided what to do with him. On December 24th, Christmas Eve by the Western calendar, Mao's interpreter and confidant, Shu came to his room and found him sitting by the window, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. "Chairman," Shu said carefully, "are you all right?" Mao turned to look at him. "Stalin doesn't trust me." Shu was silent, unsure how to respond. "I've been here for more than a week," Mao continued, "and he's met with me once. Once. For an hour. He asks questions but makes no commitments. He talks about complications in international law. He treats me like a petitioner, not like a fellow revolutionary." Perhaps he's simply being cautious, Shah ventured. The Soviet Union has many concerns. The Cold War with America, the situation in Europe. No, Mao interrupted. It's more than that. He doesn't trust me. He doesn't trust that I'm truly a communist, that I'm truly committed to the socialist cause. He thinks I might be another Tito, another national communist who will defy Moscow's leadership. Josip Broz Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia, had broken with Stalin the previous year, refusing to accept Soviet domination of the communist world. Stalin had been furious, had expelled Yugoslavia from the Kominform, had orchestrated a campaign of vilification against Tito. The Yugoslav heresy haunted Stalin, made him suspicious of any communist leader who showed signs of independence. And Mao, who had led his revolution largely without Soviet help, who had often ignored or contradicted Soviet advice, who had developed his own theories about peasant revolution and guerrilla warfare, must have seemed to Stalin like a potential second Tito. "What will you do?" Xu asked. Mao stood and walked to the desk, where Soviet newspapers were stacked. He picked one up and threw it across the room. "I'm the leader of 500 million people. I've just won one of the greatest revolutionary victories in history. And I'm being treated like an inconvenient guest, like someone Stalin wishes would go away." He turned to Xu, his face flushed with anger. "Do you know what the worst part is? I came here admiring Stalin, respecting him, wanting to learn from him. I've studied his works, followed his example, tried to apply his theories to Chinese conditions, and now I discover that he sees me as a threat, as someone to be managed and controlled rather than embraced as a comrade." "Perhaps you should speak with him directly," Shah suggested. "Tell him your concerns. Clear the air." Mao laughed bitterly. "And say what? Comrade Stalin, why don't you trust me?" He would deny it, would assure me of his fraternal feelings, and nothing would change. "No, if Stalin doesn't trust me, there's nothing I can say that will change his mind. I can only show him through my actions that China is a loyal ally of the Soviet Union." But even as he said it, Mao felt the resentment building. He had not fought for 22 years, had not led the Long March, had not defeated the Japanese and the nationalists, just to become Stalin's puppet. China was not Yugoslavia. It was too large, too populous, too important to be treated as a satellite state. On December 29th, Mao granted an interview to a Soviet journalist. It was a calculated move, a way to apply public pressure on Stalin. In the interview, Mao spoke about the importance of Sino-Soviet friendship, about China's need for Soviet aid, about his expectation that a new treaty would be signed soon. "I've come to Moscow to resolve important questions," Mao said carefully. "These questions concern the interests of the People's Republic of China in the Soviet Union. I believe that these questions will be resolved in a manner satisfactory to both sides." The interview was published in Pravda on December 31st. It was a gentle rebuke, a public reminder that Mao had not traveled to Moscow just for sightseeing, that he expected concrete results from his visit. Stalin got the message. On January 2nd, 1950, Mao was summoned to the Kremlin again. This time, Stalin was more forthcoming. "Comrade Mao," Stalin said, "we have considered your requests carefully. The Soviet Union is prepared to sign a new treaty of friendship and alliance with the People's Republic of China. We are also prepared to provide economic and technical assistance for China's reconstruction." Mao felt a surge of relief, but he kept his face neutral. "Thank you, Comrade Stalin. This is what China needs, what our people need." "However," Stalin continued, "there are conditions." Of course there were conditions. Mao waited. "The Soviet Union needs certain guarantees," Stalin said. "We need to ensure that our interests in the Far East are protected. We need access to Port Arthur and Daren in Manchuria. We need to maintain our railway rights in the region, and we need assurance that China will coordinate its foreign policy with the Soviet Union, that you will not pursue an independent course that might conflict with Soviet interests." Mao felt the anger rising again. but he forced it down. Port Arthur and Dairen were Chinese ports, occupied by Soviet forces since the end of World War II. The railway rights Stalin mentioned were concessions extracted from the nationalist government in 1945. These were infringements on Chinese sovereignty, and the kind of unequal treaties that China had suffered under for a century. But Mao needed Soviet aid. He needed Soviet technology, Soviet weapons, Soviet expertise. He couldn't afford to antagonize Stalin, not now, not when China was so weak and vulnerable. "I understand," Mao said carefully. "China values its friendship with the Soviet Union. We are prepared to make accommodations to ensure that friendship remains strong." Stalin nodded, satisfied. "Good. Then we can proceed with the treaty negotiations." Over the following weeks, Chinese and Soviet officials hammered out the details of the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. It was signed on February 14, 1950, after Mao had spent nearly 2 months in Moscow. The treaty committed both countries to mutual defense, provided for Soviet loans to China, and established frameworks for economic and technical cooperation, but it also confirmed Soviet rights to Port Arthur and Dairen, maintained Soviet control over the Chinese Eastern Railway, and effectively gave the Soviet Union veto power over major Chinese foreign policy decisions. Mao signed the treaty with mixed feelings. He had gotten some of what he wanted: Soviet aid, international recognition, a formal alliance, but he had also paid a price in Chinese sovereignty and independence. On the train back to China, Mao sat in his compartment, smoking and thinking about his time in Moscow. His interpreter, Shi Zhe, sat across from him, watching him carefully. "Chairman," Shi said finally, "you seem troubled." Mao looked up. "I learned something important in Moscow, Comrade Shi. I learned that Stalin doesn't trust me. More than that, I learned that the Soviet Union sees China as a junior partner, as a satellite state to be managed and controlled, not as an equal ally." "But we got the treaty," Shi said. "We got the aid we needed." "At what cost?" Mao asked. "We gave up our ports, our railways, our foreign policy independence. We became dependent on Soviet goodwill, on Soviet technology, on Soviet expertise. And all because Stalin doesn't trust that we can build socialism on our own, in our own way." He stubbed out his cigarette and lit another. "Do you know what I realized during those long days waiting in that dacha? I realized that Stalin sees the communist world as his personal empire, with Moscow as the center and all other communist parties as subordinates. He doesn't want allies. He wants vassals. He doesn't want partners. He wants followers." "And what will you do?" Shi asked. Mao was silent for a long moment, watching the Siberian landscape roll past. Then he said, "For now, we need the Soviet Union. We're too weak, too poor, too vulnerable to stand alone. So we'll be good allies. We'll accept Soviet aid, follow Soviet advice, coordinate our policies with Moscow." "But," Shi prompted. "But I won't forget this lesson," Mao said. "I won't forget how Stalin treated me, how he doubted me, how he tried to control me. And when China is strong enough, when we've rebuilt our economy and our military, when we no longer need Soviet aid to survive, then we'll chart our own course. We'll build socialism with Chinese characteristics, in the Chinese way, according to Chinese conditions." He turned to look at Shi, his eyes hard. "Stalin thinks I might be another Tito, another national communist who will defy Moscow. And you know what? He's right to worry, because I didn't fight for 22 years just to trade one foreign master for another. I didn't liberate China from the nationalists and the Japanese just to become Stalin's puppet." "But the treaty," Shi began. "The treaty is necessary," Mao interrupted, "for now. But treaties can be renegotiated. Alliances can evolve. And when the time is right, when China is strong enough, we'll renegotiate our relationship with the Soviet Union. We'll demand to be treated as equals, not as subordinates. And if the Soviets don't like it, well, then we'll see who needs whom more." Over the following years, Mao's prediction proved accurate. China accepted massive Soviet aid, thousands of Soviet advisors, hundreds of industrial projects, loans worth billions of rubles. Chinese students studied in Soviet universities. Chinese factories used Soviet technology. The People's Liberation Army was equipped with Soviet weapons, but tensions simmered beneath the surface. Stalin died in 1953, replaced eventually by Nikita Khrushchev, who was more flexible but also more unpredictable. Khrushchev's 1956 speech denouncing Stalin shocked Mao, who saw it as an attack on the legitimacy of communist leadership. The Soviet Union's handling of the Hungarian uprising the same year and later the Suez Crisis convinced Mao that Soviet foreign policy was erratic and unreliable. By the late 1950s, Sino-Soviet relations were deteriorating rapidly. Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, an ambitious but disastrous attempt to rapidly industrialize China through mass mobilization. Soviet advisors warned that the plan was unrealistic, that it would lead to economic catastrophe. Mao ignored them, seeing their criticism as evidence that the Soviets wanted to keep China weak and dependent. The Great Leap Forward did indeed lead to catastrophe, a famine that killed tens of millions of people. But Mao blamed Soviet sabotage and lack of support rather than his own policies. The rift widened. In 1960, Khrushchev abruptly withdrew all Soviet advisors from China, taking their blueprints and technical documents with them. It was a devastating blow to China's development, leaving hundreds of projects unfinished. But it also freed China from Soviet control, allowed Mao to pursue his own vision without Soviet interference. The Sino-Soviet split became public in the early 1960s, with both sides engaging in bitter ideological disputes. China accused the Soviet Union of revisionism, of betraying true Marxism-Leninism, of seeking accommodation with Western imperialism. The Soviet Union accused China of adventurism, of dogmatism, of risking nuclear war with its aggressive rhetoric. By the late 1960s, the two communist giants were on the brink of war. Border clashes along the Ussuri River in 1969 killed dozens of soldiers on both sides. Both countries moved troops to their shared border. The Soviet Union reportedly considered a preemptive nuclear strike against Chinese nuclear facilities. And through it all, Mao remembered those days in Moscow in December 1949, remembered Stalin's cold assessment, remembered the realization that the Soviet Union didn't trust him, didn't see China as an equal partner. In conversations with his inner circle in the 1960s and 70s, Mao often returned to that moment. "Stalin didn't trust me," he would say. "From the very beginning, he saw me as a threat, as someone to be controlled. He made me wait in that dacha like a petitioner, like a beggar seeking alms. He treated me like a subordinate, not like a fellow revolutionary." "But you signed the treaty," someone would point out. "I had no choice," Mao would reply. "China was weak. We needed Soviet aid. But I never forgot how Stalin treated me, and I never forgave it. The Soviet Union wanted China to be a satellite, a vassal state. But China is too great, too ancient, too proud to be anyone's satellite. We are the Middle Kingdom. We bow to no one." In his final years, as China emerged from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution and began to open to the West, Mao would receive American President Richard Nixon in Beijing. It was a stunning reversal, a communist China allying with capitalist America against the Soviet Union. When asked by his advisors how he could justify this alliance, Mao reportedly said, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Soviet Union wants to dominate China, wants to control us, wants to keep us weak. America has no such ambitions. America is too far away, too different to threaten China's independence. So we align with America against the Soviet Union. It's simple geopolitics. But it was also personal. It was revenge for those humiliating days in Moscow in 1949, revenge for Stalin's distrust, revenge for decades of Soviet condescension and control. What Mao Zedong said when he realized Stalin didn't trust him evolved over time, from initial confusion to anger to determination. December 1949 in Moscow. Stalin doesn't trust me. He treats me like a petitioner, not like a fellow revolutionary. To his interpreter, Shizhe, I came here admiring Stalin, respecting him, wanting to learn from him, and now I discover that he sees me as a threat, as someone to be managed and controlled rather than embraced as a comrade. On the train back to China, Stalin sees the communist world as his personal empire, with Moscow as the center and all other communist parties as subordinates. He doesn't want allies, he wants vassals. His determination: I won't forget this lesson. When China is strong enough, when we no longer need Soviet aid to survive, then we'll chart our own course. We'll build socialism with Chinese characteristics in the Chinese way. His prophecy? Stalin thinks I might be another Tito, another national communist who will defy Moscow. And you know what? He's right to worry. In later years, reflecting on the experience, I didn't fight for 22 years just to trade one foreign master for another. I didn't liberate China from the nationalists and the Japanese just to become Stalin's puppet. The realization that Stalin didn't trust him was a turning point for Mao, one that shaped Sino-Soviet relations for decades and ultimately contributed to the split between the two communist giants. It taught Mao that even within the communist world, national interests trumped ideological solidarity, that the Soviet Union would always prioritize its own power and security over the interests of other communist states. And it reinforced Mao's conviction that China must be self-reliant, must develop its own path to socialism, must never again be dependent on any foreign power, whether capitalist or communist. Stalin's distrust, intended to keep China subordinate to Soviet interests, ultimately had the opposite effect. It made Mao determined to break free from Soviet control, to establish China as an independent power, to challenge Soviet leadership of the communist world. In the end, Stalin's fears were justified. Mao did become another Tito, another national communist who defied Moscow's leadership. But unlike Tito, who led a small Balkan nation, Mao led the world's most populous country. And when China broke with the Soviet Union, it shattered the unity of the communist world, created a three-way Cold War between the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, and fundamentally altered the balance of power in Asia and beyond. All because Stalin didn't trust Mao, and Mao never forgot it.